On behalf of the National Park Service, I would like to welcome you to the African Burial Ground National Monument. African Burial Ground is one of more than 400 national park sites throughout the United States, and there are more than 13 located in New York City. It is an honor to introduce tonight's moderator for examining the findings at the New York African Burial Ground, Dr. Cheryl Wilson. Dr. Wilson served as the founding director of the Office of Public Education and Interpretation from 1993 to 2005. Prior to this site becoming part of the National Park System, Dr. Wilson holds a master's degree and a doctorate in cultural anthropology from the New School of Social Research, and is the author of New York City's African Slave Owners, a Social and Material Cultural History. Please welcome Dr. Wilson.
Okay. Thank you. Good evening, and welcome to the panel discussion that's a part of the 15th reburial anniversary for the human remains, the ancestors that were excavated between 1991 and 92. They were studied for off and on, correct me if I'm wrong, Jean, at least 10 years. And finally, in October of 2003, they were returned here to the African Burial Ground to be reburied. They traveled, at least four of the coffins with an adult man, an adult woman, and two children, a male and female. We were guessing at that, but hopefully. They traveled from Washington, D.C. To, I have to look at this, to Baltimore, Maryland, and Philadelphia, as well as Newark and Wilmington, Delaware, before returning to the burial ground, actually returning to the Wall Street location of the slave auction house. And then, and this was wonderful, and I'm visualizing it now, there was a parade going up Broadway, and let me tell you, that takes a lot of doing to get a parade to go up Broadway rather than down, and it happened, where the remains and the many followers went back to the burial ground for the ceremonies that ended in the reburial of the 419 human remains. Barbara? I was going to ask you just to wave that card around because I was just remembering that in addition to the 419 ancestral remains, we had over 10,000 what we called ancestor cards from people around the country, some from countries abroad as well, where people wrote their messages to the ancestors that were being reburied. And we buried four small coffins with those 10,000 plus ancestral messages. So should the site ever, and we think God forbid, be excavated in the future, in addition to finding human remains, there may be some fragments left at that point of some of those ancestor cards. For those of you who might be new to the burial ground was rediscovered, because certainly there were always people who knew about it, in 1991, when the United States General Services Administration was in the process of building this office building. A lot of drama, a lot of heartbreak during this time. We believe that there are approximately 15,000 ancestral remains buried on the site outside the memorialized portion of the site that were never excavated or studied. Right now, you're looking at some of the smaller coffins. This was a member of the Federal Steering Committee that made hard decisions and fought very hard for us to be here tonight, to even have this conversation, Miriam Francis. You're looking at, what were they called, Jean? The coffins went into larger crypts. These were all made in Ghana, and shipped to the United States. This we used to refer to as an adult male that was buried at the burial ground, and he has his hands in the position that a few of the other burials were as well. You're looking at the engraving on the top of the coffin, the 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 coffins and the crypts that were being prepared for the final reburial. This is a part of the ceremony coming up Broadway, the parade, and again, there's an image of the crypts in preparation for the final reburial. Um, there were quite a few celebrities that were a part of the reburial ceremony. You're looking at Maya Angelou, of course, and I can't think of his name. I always think Star Trek, the black Star Trek captain. So if somebody remembers his name, please. Avery Brooks. That's Avery Brooks on the side of Maya Angelou there. Now, if you've been here before, you know I've been working for quite a while on a collection of collage and poetry. And I was in California visiting my family there, and I woke up at 5 o'clock in the morning, and I wrote this poem about Maya Angelou. And this was a couple of weeks after the reburial ceremony. Mother Maya. She is elegant, frail, and spare, yet strong, supported by the living and drawing upon the strength and fortitude of unnamed African ancestors. She stands boldly in the seat of New York City government, presiding over the African burial ground, declaring to the nation, to the world, to the universe, the power of the past revealed to influence the present and change the future. Mother Maya brings peace and purpose, singing and sashaying to the rhythm of the drum that echoes and reverberates across the Atlantic, reconnecting Africa to New York, Africa to London, Africa to Brazil, to Liverpool, Nova Scotia, Jamaica, Amsterdam, Veracruz, North and South Carolina, Virginia, Georgia, Alabama, and Arkansas. And so on and so forth throughout the diaspora. Mother Maya brings peace and purpose to the African burial ground. Ashe, ashe, ashe. Just in case you weren't here, and again, if anybody's never heard of the African burial ground, this was not an easy task to accomplish what has been accomplished in terms of the African burial ground today being a national monument. These are some of the people involved. There are more than 1,500 newspaper and magazine articles about the struggle between members of the descendant community and a government agency, being the General Services Administration, regarding the excavation, the preservation, as well as the memorialization of the site. These are some of the key people involved at Howard University with the analysis. Again, I say off and on because sometimes we had money and other times we didn't have money. It's just that simple, okay? There's no other way to put it. Dr. Michael Blakey, which most people are familiar with, was the head of the team working on the skeletal biology. Dr. Fatima Jackson, we have here in person. So again, I love this picture, Fatima. I just, had to put it in there. Dr. Warren Perry, who is the co-director for the archaeological study, along with Gene Housen, that's going to speak to us a little while. Who am I missing? Leslie Rankin Hill also worked at Howard University as a major contributor and team member here. And Dr. Edna Medford, who unfortunately could not be here tonight, was in charge of the historical research. However, she promises for future events she will be here. So we're holding her to that because she has so much to share with us. Okay. Again, this was not an easy situation. So we're talking 12 plus years of interpretation. I then headed the Office of Public Education and interpretation, and sometimes had as many as 15 full-time staff members working. And I go to places where people are talking about preservation, and they say, "Oh, you're Dr. Wilson." I said, "What do you mean?" They said, "You're an example of how not to do historic preservation according to the GSA, because never in the history of the GSA had there been a public information office that existed for 12 and a half years. We were, for a long time, we were sort of month to month and then year to year. I was told early on, don't make any plans, any long-term plans, number one, because people are not going to be interested in the burial ground for a long, prolonged period. So what they said was stick to a 6-month to 1-year plan. And again, like I said, I'm, I guess, the enemy of historic preservation now, but that's my association. Reverend Jackson was here. He, after 9/11, he began to bring people from the Rainbow Coalition ministers here monthly to start their day with a prayer service before they went down to Wall Street to make money. Okay, that for us was a very important thing, that he was associating himself with the burial ground. You got at the top Reverend Daughtry, who was here this morning, who has hung in here with us forever in terms of reminding us always about the spiritual value of the burial ground. Because for me, first, I'm anthropologists, we're scientists, we're historians, and that's certainly important to us. But first and foremost, this was a final resting place for human beings. Now, it's debatable as to, some people say they chose the spot, though I like to think they had some influence on the spot, but I wouldn't go so far as to say they chose it themselves. Okay, I think we're being a little too optimistic here. But at the same time, history tells us that Africans always were agents for themselves. Okay, we look at slavery in a very simplistic way, and we don't understand that. I like to say that certainly there was resistance from the first day that anybody was put on a ship, and that resistance usually consisted of, to my mind, I call it infanticide, sadly, homicide, and suicide. Those were some of the major ways. But the people who lived to struggle to make it, from one day to the other, they did all kinds of things that we cannot imagine, including poisoning the whole family, okay, or whatever was necessary. So when I see these images, I am reminded that this is the history that we come from. And our voices are the most important things that we have to advocate for the burial ground, that it continues to have this site, that it continues to have the stature that it has, and that we build, of course, larger audiences. And because I know for a fact that people are still interested in the African burial ground. I have no doubt about that. You're also looking at Dr. Lawrence Pace, who created the Triumph of the Human Spirit, which is in Foley Square now. We've, in many ways, remapped Lower Manhattan, and we've remapped it with the discovery of the burial ground in a way that honors the true history that was covered up in addition to the human remains themselves. Again, there's Miriam Francis on this end, and that's Io Harrington, who was the chair of a group of advocates known as Friends of the African Burial Ground. And one of their members, who is also a longtime volunteer, Laura Lamuli, is still hanging in here with us. Okay, thank you so much. And it's very hard for people to conceive that New York was a hotbed of slavery. And in fact, some historians speculate that the New York Stock Exchange has its beginnings in the buying and selling of human beings, particularly those of African descent. This was a slave auction house that was established 1711 at Wall Street, where Africans were sold, Native Americans were rented, and enemies of the British Crown were also sold. Now, this is a rare ad. Actually, I've come across three of them, but and my children say I shouldn't mention how long I've been looking for things, like over 25 years now. Okay, and Jean can to attest to the things we've done trying to find documents from the past. This is an advertisement from the New York Mercury, July of 1775. The subscriber, having broke up housekeeping for the present, has for sale a Negro man and Negro woman with her child of about 2 years old. The Negro man and his wife will be sold together or separate as may suit the purchaser. They both understand housework, and the Negro man has been used to assist in the callow channery business, making candles, in other words. Inquire of their price of Abraham Van Dersen at number 10 Dock Street, July 1775. Now, this is not your ordinary ad. We're talking about families for sale. And this is not the first one I saw, but that completely blows me away. I've seen for probably 20, at least 15 years, advertisements for individuals, particularly men, sometimes women, sometimes young girls and boys. But this is clear documentation of African families being torn apart. The buyer can do whatever they like. They can take them all together as separate. For me, this stays with me as one of the most powerful things I have learned at the African Burial Ground, and I have learned many things. The sale of African men, women, and children were common. The advertisement that you just seen is one of more than 1,000 in the tri-state area, New York, New Jersey, Connecticut. This is one of 7 maps of New York City during this period. And what's so interesting to me about this is there are only 3 maps that mention the burial ground. And there are 7 that exist during this period. And we're not talking about a small place. Clearly, everybody who lived in New York at that time knew where what is being called here the Negroes' burial ground. And I also want to point out that probably the people who lived and died here did not call it the Negroes' burial ground. This is a depiction of, remind me, is this the Marshak? This is known as the Marshak map, who this obviously was not a Negro man or an African by any stretch of the imagination, and this was his rendering. One of the things, and I was involved in different ways early on, once the New York Times, I used to do walking tours of the area, and I had taken probably 7,000 people on a walking tour, and I get a call from a New York Times reporter that wants to know why would there be black people in a white community? This was his mystery. And I said, I think you need to do some research and call me back when you have a real question, because I'm getting some real questions that, I can talk about. And of course, I'm sure, a lot of people thought that way. The Landmarks Commission asked me to try to figure out what was the burial ground called by the people who used it. And I had been, again, doing this research for a while for my dissertation, and every organization for or by African people of African descent had the word African in it. The African Free Schools, which, by the way, became the public school system of New York as it exists today. The African Methodist Church. Again, I had a list of about 30 organizations, the African Dorcas Society and so on. So it was there was at the time not a single organization where people were referring to themselves as Negroes. Now, the Landmarks Commission, I will say they had their own agenda, as people do, because their concern was that they didn't want it to be thought that African American people had pressured them into renaming it, when in fact that might go against what was historically correct. But again, when you've got this list of organizations, again, almost 30, that had the word African in it. It's very clear that that's what people were calling themselves. Again, this is one, and the other thing to me that's always a mystery is why did the other people not include the African burial ground? It seems even at that point, our presence is being erased in early New York. And this is a significant presence. One of the things that I always tell school groups in particular, if you don't remember anything at the end of the talk, try and remember that New York City during the 1700s had the largest enslaved African population of any place in colonial America except for Charleston, South Carolina. Or, in other words, we were number 2 in the slavery business. Okay, but again, we're rewriting the past in this respect. Today, Triumph of the Human Spirit sits at Foley Square, which, by the way, this was the location the GSA wanted these remains reburied in. And again, that was just another point of contention that lasted, again, for years, that was not resolved because certainly the people who were representatives of the Federal Steering Committee, they insisted that the remains, number 1, should not have been excavated. Number 2, don't care how long it takes you to excavate it using what's known as the historical archaeological method, meaning one bone at a time, using trowels, using your hands, taking times. Jean, I used to say 7 to 10 days to excavate one human remain. Okay. Again, GSA was not happy with, and people were working around the clock. There was no such thing as people came to work from 9 to 5 or 8 to 4. People were working around the clock because according to GSA, their mission was not to excavate a burial ground. It was to put this building here, under budget and all of that. But today, we have African Burial Ground Way. We have reminders to people everywhere who travel to one of the most traveled cities in the world that we were here and we are still here. This is in City Hall Park. You're looking at the map of the historic district. Joan Maynard, if you know Joan, Joan was the director for many years of the Weeksville Society. And after the first day I met her, I told everybody when I grow up, I want to be Joan Maynard, okay? But Joan spent so much time dedicating herself. And I mean, I saw it was a struggle to preserving this history, to making it available to people. And, you know, when I just go on Facebook, I'm so impressed with the Weeksville Society today, so that her legacy stands out there. But she used to say, I am looking forward to the day that everybody who travels in this area knows that this is the African burial ground and knows at least a little bit about that history. This is from a collage that I did. I love Oprah Winfrey, and when I read her magazine, at that last page, it says, one thing I know for sure. One thing I know for sure from my experience working, struggling, fighting, okay, with the GSA and others, is that ancestors have empowered us to tell this story. You know, I say to the rangers and the other people here that are providing information, we would never be having this conversation were it not for many people who have died to see that this happened. So our ancestors, you know, have empowered us in this way. I don't remember the year. I want to say 1996. 6 Ghanaian kings came to the burial ground as a part of the Fahankra tour. They also went to Howard University, and the word Fahankra means to reunite a house divided. And Joan had been sick, and she had had a really bad day, and when she finally got here, she was not in good shape. But she said, it's no way I wouldn't be here today. She said, because most Africans completely disavow any knowledge of their ancestors being involved in the slave trade with the Europeans. And she said to actually hear people of authority come here and say, we've come to atone for our ancestors' involvement in the slave trade. She said, if I wasn't here, Dad, I'd be dead. She said, so I didn't care how I got here. And again, so many things that she said to me, sticks with me today. But again, one thing I know for sure is that ancestors empower descendants. On October 5th of 2007, the burial ground site became a national monument. And if you don't know her, the superintendent is here. Wave at everybody, Shirley McKinney. And she is doing a great job here. Okay. That's it for me. So now we're going to start with the archaeology in particular. Now, I'm not going to read everything that's in our very accomplished panelists' bios that were sent to me, but I am going to read some of them. And Jean Housen, again, worked with Warren Perry, seems like for decades, off and on for 10 years, but it seemed a lot longer to us, on analyzing the artifacts from the burial ground. And I was, in fact, inspired by the artifacts that were found. And people often, said, well, there were so few things found in terms of personal possessions. But we're talking about poor people who had very little. And probably if they had something of real value, they left it with the family to sell or to live off of, to survive. But because I was inspired by Warren and Jean, I wrote this poem, which will also be in the book. Artifacts, the things left behind. Small things. Wasim, can you hear me? Am I good? Okay, thank you. Small things often overlooked by prying eyes. Beads, glass, and clay fired. Blue, brown, red, colorless. Tiny crystals. Seashells carrying memories of the fateful journey on the rough seas that brought me to this conquered land. Charms and wristlets, small animal bones and buttons. Perhaps they carry no meaning or value for others, as they are not rubies or diamonds torn from caves or underground mines. But these small things left behind are signs of my perseverance and resistance. My day, my time, my labor, my child, my man, my body belong to others. And yet, those small things, overlooked and forgotten, connect me to the earth, connect me to the Almighty. They protect and assure me, bind me to my past and to my people, to my sweet home forgotten. God and those small things held close to my heart, time after time, day in and day out, keep me waking up in my right mind. Thank you. Okay. Now, I am so excited to see the presentation, so I won't say another word, except I'd like to introduce you to Dr. Jean Housen. Dr. Housen's involvement in the New York African Burial Ground spans several decades. She prepared the National Historic Landmark nomination for the site while working as an urban archaeologist at the New York City Landmarks Preservation Commission. Later served as co-director for archaeology with Howard University team, along with Dr. Warren Perry, as co-editor of the final archaeology technical report. As a subject matter expert for the design of the Interpretive Center, which you know downstairs as a visitor center, along with me, her African diaspora archaeological research has also focused on plantation sites on Montserrat in the Eastern Caribbean. Dr. Housen received her PhD in anthropology from New York University. She has taught courses at NYU, Rutgers, and Vassar College, and currently serves as principal archaeologist at NV5 Incorporated. Dr. Housen.
Good evening, welcome. Speaking of maps, Cheryl, you're just going to have to move over into my seat. Got your head right. Yes. I began my involvement with the African Burial Ground in 1989 when I was asked to assess archaeological potential of this property where we're sitting, 290 Broadway. It's just as part of my job. One of the things we want to do is kind of clarify what the different specialties do on this research team. So I'm going to talk to you about what archaeologists do and what we've learned and how we learned it on this project. We don't start by digging in the ground. We start by looking at maps and other documents. For instance, this map, and Cheryl was just talking about how many maps did not depict the African burial ground. Well, it's circled right here. It's not there. But we know from other research that it had been there for decades by this time, by 1730. It may have been there for a century by that time, right? But certainly since the dawn of the 18th century, probably it was there in the 17th century. I just want to draw attention to one thing that's really clear to me when I look at this map, which is the small size of the city at that time. You could walk from one end of the city to the other in a half an hour, right? It was a small city in colonial America. But the cemetery was outside of town, right? It's on the north edge of town, on the north edge of the commons, near a swamp, and near the powder house. It was isolated in that part of this landscape, and isolated from the surveillance that the city's African people lived with throughout most of their daily lives. This is a manuscript from a few years later, and it is the first one that actually labeled the cemetery. Where the circle is, I'll show you it in a detail. It says Negroes Burying Place. Again, just below it on this map, it says Swamp and Powder House. And over here it says the Collect, which was the Collect Pond, which was the water source in early Manhattan. That's where Foley Square is today. And that's where the artwork and the plaques in the ground. You can't miss knowing that the African burial ground is here if you walk through Foley Square, but it's not the site of the burial ground. That's where the pond was. And then the Mareshelk map is very clearly labeled on this map, which you looked at a couple minutes ago in Dr. Wilson's talk. Flipping it around so you can read it really clearly. The white outline here is this block of real estate that we're sitting on. So that was the archaeological excavation site. And I'm going to point something out to you. It was already being mislabeled on the map because we know it extended at least down to here where there were hundreds of burials. But this map makes it look like it was north of that line, and we'll come back to that. So even though it showed up on the map, we know from the archaeology that that's misrepresented. I'm going to fast forward 42 years now. By this time, the cemetery had been encroached upon by the development of the city. And you see where the circle is? It was laid out in city blocks. 1797. After that, it really would become lost to collective memory, even though historians knew that this was its former location. When it was rediscovered, very few people knew that it had been there. But that started in the 1790s when the real estate was sold. And now I'm going to fast forward 200 years. I want to just take 1 minute to dispel one of the really persistent myths about the African burial ground, which is that it was discovered during construction by construction workers building this building. In fact, archaeologists were on the site at the beginning in order to conduct tests because they suspected there might be some remnant of the African burial ground. Little did we know how much of it would be left, but there were archaeologists on the site. They were doing their test excavations, and they found the first burial within a day. But let me tell you, and Dr. Wilson made this point it was such a struggle. From the minute the first burial number 1 was unearthed, this became a struggle. And in this picture, what you see is a construction site, and in the back are tents, plastic tents. Under those tents is where the archaeologists were working. It was awful. I didn't work on the excavation myself. At this time, I was working for the Landmarks Commission. I had a cushy desk job. But it was a struggle from day one for everybody involved in many ways. And I just want to make the point that it was a struggle just to exhume these burials with any sort of propriety or with any kind of scientific care because of the pressure to get it done and the construction that was going on simultaneously all around the archaeologists to get this tower built, which was the GSA's mission, as Cheryl pointed out. Ultimately, graves extended across the entire block. And you could see, I mean, when I visited the site, this is when I was at Landmarks, if you can tell anecdotes, I can tell anecdotes. When I visited the site, when they were still just, they excavated starting here and working in that direction, they were still just over here. You could see by the lay of the land that there were going to be graves across the entire parcel. You could see it. They were buried 12 to 25 feet deep. We had thought, oh, well, there's all these buildings built on it, and there had been many built. They were underneath those building basements, and you could tell right from the start. And the people who wanted to build this building were in total denial about it. Just pointing that out. And also I want to point out, you see how the burials are very, very dense on the left-hand side of this map, and less dense on the right-hand side on the eastern part. That isn't because there were fewer burials. That's because they stopped the excavation before they got to that part. There's no reason to think there were any fewer burials, that it was any less dense on the eastern part of the site. And that's the part that's been preserved at the present time, thanks to the struggle that everyone put in. Okay, the archaeologist's job. One of the things includes, the main thing I guess you'd have to say for archaeology is the spatial analysis of the finds, both vertically, you're looking top to bottom as you excavate, and horizontally over the landscape. And one of the things that we were tasked with trying to do, very difficult, was to group the burials in time, into groups by time. I can't really go into all that went into that. It did take years. But we were able to group burials into 4 chronological groupings. The early, and on this particular map rendition, they're shown shaded. Okay, so the earliest, a middle group that is most of the burials, because there wasn't really any way to date most of the burials, and a slightly later group, and then the very latest group. So it's just shown in different kinds of shading here. They can't really be dated precisely. There's really only one that has a date on it, which we'll get to. That said, we think that the 4-sided coffins that tapered, like this one here, and like that one there, are the earliest period. Those coffins represent the early period. And we do think, for various reasons, having to do with maps and documents, that those found to the north of a fence line, and we saw a fence line on that map, the line on that dashed line, we think that the burials to the north of the fence were the latest group of burials. And these little arrows are pointing to, they're just soil stains, right? As archaeologists dig, they scrape the soil down and they see a stain, they draw it. And this line of soil stains is that fence that showed up on historic maps. So we could see on the ground, and there's no question that the area south of that fence was much more densely used for graves than to the north of the fence. We think that the ones to the north were from the time of the Revolution or after. Another thing that we map in space is the distribution of burials according to sex and age. And the sex and age are something that the skeletal biologists determine. I don't have that expertise. This was a big team of experts. It enables us to look for groupings of graves, for instance. Okay, it's coded on this map. We just think this way as archaeologists. So men have these green stripes, women have the red cross hatching. And subadults, what we call subadults, infants and children who we don't know their sex because they're too young to tell from their bones. They're the smaller speckled coffins. So over here we have a group that's a woman with 2 very young children next to her. And you can tell that at a glance by looking at this map if you know how it's coded. And then the ones that are white are the ones where sex could not be determined. So that's another thing that archaeologists do. They take other data and they show it in space and how it's arranged on the land. And I won't spend much time on this, but I just want to give you an idea. This just illustrates the kind of thing, once you're able to say, okay, these northern burials are later, then we can look at that group of burials and look at other things. This is infection among burials from the late period, according to age and sex. But we only know they're from the late period because we figured that out through the archaeological and spatial analysis. So it enables you to look at your data in that way. Okay, one of our main focuses as the archaeologist was on understanding what constituted the shared burial practice of African New Yorkers. Okay, there were 5 aspects that can be discerned through the archaeological research. Now remember that is the physical evidence, the things we can observe in the physical evidence. The position, the orientation, individual interment, coffins, and shrouding. And I'll go into each of these a little bit. Position. Most had their limbs, their legs extended, all of them had their legs extended. Most had their arms extended and lying either at the side or maybe crossed over the pelvis, as in the example Dr. Wilson showed. All of them were laid on their back. I mean, 100%. Not something we could ever have known or certainly have expected. And African burial practices are very varied. So it was a bit of a surprise. Orientation, head to the west. 97.8%. I mean, that's clearly a shared burial practice. That just means how the body was placed in the ground, you know, which way was the head, which way was the feet. Many people that I talk to say, oh, well, that's a standard Christian burial. But it wasn't at the time. This cemetery was much more uniform in orientation than other cemeteries of that time period. Both those that have been excavated archaeologically and those that we know about from visiting colonial burial grounds. Go to Trinity Churchyard and convince yourself every which way. This was completely different. We believe that this practice took hold really quickly among Africans in the city and elsewhere in the North American colonies, and was retained as the early black churches were established. I think it came to be shared among Africans of different cultural backgrounds as part of a concept of proper treatment of the dead, just like the body position. Individual interment. I give you some food for thought here. We did not identify any mass graves. People ask me this all the time. Oh, they hear about they heard about the African burial ground. Oh, were they mass graves? It's just sort of this vision that people have of bodies being dumped in a mass grave. I mean, okay, here's some circumstances under which you would expect to find a mass grave, right? A severe epidemic, a mass execution, a war. New York saw all of those things during the period of this cemetery. We did not find any. There's only a few graves that had more than one person in it, and typically there was more than one coffin in that grave. And you know, the examples are a woman with a baby, that sort of thing. Individual burial was part of the proper treatment of the dead in this community. Use of coffins. 91.6, I mean, most people were buried in coffins. Those that were not, Many of them were in that northern part of the cemetery that we think was in use during the Revolution, when two things. Wood was really scarce in New York during the Revolution. Really scarce. I mean, people were burning their furniture, right? There were also a lot of strangers in town during the Revolution because it was British, it was held by the British, and people did flee here to get behind the British lines. So there were Africans who were strangers in the city in that period who might not have had someone to attend to their burial. So I think those are two reasons. Anyway, putting that aside, the use of coffins was clearly considered proper for burial. Let me just back up once. As I said before, there were the four-sided ones that tapered at the feet that were from the early period. And then they gave way to these shouldered, what we think of as coffin-shaped coffins. They're shouldered or sometimes called hexagonal. And there were some that were just plain rectangular, not tapered, not anything, just a rectangular box. And once those shouldered ones were adopted, it was really typical for the adults. But for children, they were often just simple rectangular or four-sided tapered types, even in the latest period. One hypothesis we made is that children and infants' coffins might have been made often by the family rather than being ordered by from a coffin maker, so that they were built simply and they weren't as expensive, and anybody could make that kind of a coffin. And we may talk about this later in tonight's program, but many, many, many infants and children were laid to rest in this cemetery. It was a common occurrence. Oh, sorry. This was just to show you, this is infants' coffins. There were a lot of four-sided ones, and infants were always in coffins, as opposed to some of the adults who were not. All right, now we can move on. Even in the case of a shared grave, the woman and these two young children were all in separate coffins. Okay, even though coffins were really, really the norm, coffin decoration was quite rare at the African burial ground. This man's coffin was decorated with small tacks. You probably know it well. The heart-shaped design, that's not an uncommon design on coffins, but in this context, it may have been a Sankofa symbol, which would have been recognized by some in the community. The design, which you can see a little bit better in the drawing, a lot better in the drawing, appears to have a date, 1769. It was split right down the 6. So that's the only date we have from the entire cemetery. But I think it's a good date for this particular burial. Most people, oh, here's another, sorry, I forgot about HW. The initials and numerals, 3 and 8. And I just have to digress for a moment. I was asked a few years ago for a collection to write an archaeological biography of a person from the African burial ground. And I wanted to look at someone who had good skeletal preservation, but other than that, how could I pick one individual? Should it be Burial 101 with the Sankofa coffin? Should it be, 340 with the beads? Or should it be someone who really didn't have anything distinctive about their burial? But in the end, I tell you, I chose HW largely because I could write about this man without having to refer to him only as a number. I could call him HW. And it made it easier for me to try and write his biography. I'm not going to go into too much detail about him. He had evidence of musculoskeletal stress, like most of the people buried here. He had evidence of infections, some healed and some ongoing at the time he died. And there was evidence that some sort of traumatic injury caused his death. And we don't know what that might have been, but his death was caused by an injury. His coffin decoration, the tacks themselves, suggest that it was built after about 1860. But he may have spent his childhood in Africa and been brought here after 1741, after the uprising of 1741. Based on his bones, he died when he was only in his late 30s, which conforms to the numerals 3 and 8. We think it was his age. But that is based independently on the skeletal analysis. And one last footnote. A young child was later buried just above him in an overlapping grave. And I may be coming back to that. Okay. Now, shrouding, that was that last thing in my list of 5. Most people were probably wrapped in a shroud. Half of the graves had pins, which pins could have been used to fasten a shroud. These are replicas that you can look at in the Visitors Center. I hope people do, because it was another struggle getting the replicas made. A couple of little caveats. Many times a shroud would just be wrapped around a body during the preparation for burial. Whoever was tasked with preparing the corpse might have just wrapped the body in a shroud. And also we had to keep in mind that sometimes women's clothing in particular was fastened with these kinds of straight pins. So some of the women might have been buried in clothing and not shrouded. Their clothing doesn't show up as well in terms of material. But that said, it was a newborn buried with a woman, and all of these pins were recorded around the infant's skeletal remains. Up here is the skull. It's really hard to see. This is the infant's skull. This is the rib cage and spine of the woman. Right? The infant's remains are right on top of the woman's remains. And the archaeologists recorded the location of every one of those pins. This many pins on a newborn surely had a spiritual significance. It wasn't just for fastening a shroud. So the pins are evidence for shrouding, but in many cases at the African burial ground, they have a greater meaning than that. Okay, there were some other less common practices at the African burial ground. The marking of graves, which I'll get to in a minute, the use of people buried in street clothing as opposed to being shrouded, people being buried with personal adornment and belongings, and other kinds of grave goods. These are less typical at the burial ground. Now, marked graves, this is over in the western part where there were graves in this alley. They hadn't been disturbed. We had remnants of the original ground surface with markings showing burials. All right. Most of the graveyard had been severely disturbed by later construction and grading, et cetera, et cetera. So we didn't have the original ground surface. And I don't know for a fact whether archaeologists maybe missed it or were in too much of a, I don't know, but it could easily just have all been gone. So we don't know. I suspect that many, if not most of the graves were marked. And from the groupings of burials, it does look as though often a person was buried immediately next to someone else, or a child was buried on top of an adult, or just by the spatial analysis, it looks to me like people knew where their relatives were buried. Items found from clothing or from adornment were rare, but extremely evocative, either of ordinary dress or of special individual and perhaps family identities. So here I'm going to show items as they were found, and then the replicas that you can see in the Visitors Center to show what they would have looked like when they were brand new. Cufflinks, possibly these were a prized item of personal adornment for the man. He was in his 40s who was buried with them on. Simple wooden buttons. They would be used to fasten breeches or a shirt. Why were some, and particularly men, we can tell often if they were clothed rather than shrouded. What, we have to ask, why were some people buried in clothing? I mean, this must have to do with who was preparing the body, which might have been family, it might have been church fellows, it might have been a stranger. These are things we can't know from the archaeology. And here's an item of adornment, a silver pendant. It's quite beautiful. This was buried with a child of 4. They found it when they were cleaning the bones in the laboratory. Other children also were adorned. Okay, this is an early burial, which you all know now because it's that tapered shaped coffin of a man. It was overlain by a tiny coffin that had the remains of an infant less than 2 months old. And that infant was buried wearing, it was at their neck, so possibly a necklace of 8 beads. And specialists determined that these beads were West African in origin. This is an infant, less than 2 months old. And then the most spectacular adornment was found on a woman, burial 340, a string of waist beads with glass beads and cowrie shells, and a bracelet of glass beads in alternating colors of turquoise and white or yellow. Yes?
Do we know possibly when in New York City people were wearing that type of cufflink? Is there a time period that you're aware of?
It's throughout the 18th century. It's not really good for dating. It was a common type. These are the beads, some of the beads and the cowrie shells, which were hard to determine what they were, but they were cowrie shells. A few people were laid to rest with belongings other than clothing or jewelry, personal belongings, I guess. Their mourners placed these seemingly ordinary items with the body, perhaps both to respect their person and keep in mind that any individualizing gesture such as this was fraught with meaning in the context of the dehumanization of slavery. So it might seem like such an ordinary thing, but it had real significance. And it may also be a reflection of beliefs about the deceased journey in the afterlife, what they were buried with. Other items weren't so ordinary, and they more clearly signify spiritual practices. So this man was laid to rest with a bundle of copper alloy rings and pins beneath his right arm. The rings were probably in a cloth pouch, and they might have been pinned to his shroud. They may be from a talisman or a conjuring bundle, which in turn may tell us something about this older man. He was around 60 years old when he died, as a spiritual practitioner. Or possibly it says something about his need for protection in the afterlife. I'm very humble about interpreting, because I don't know. And here's another document from the distant past. John Watts wrote a letter to a business associate in 1762 about Belinda. I'm going to speak it out loud for the purpose of the film. Mr. Isaac Younghusband has a wench of mine in his hands called Belinda, middle-aged, but not very comely. She is a simple, innocent creature and a very good cook, has lived long in my family, and indeed was a most necessary servant. But her simplicity led her to trifle about charms, which alarmed my female family too much to keep her. Now, unfamiliar conjuring and other spiritual practices would have been frightening to people that weren't non-Africans, right? I'd say that John Watts's sexism and racism were amply captured in this quote. Belinda, of course, bears the brunt of both. But more to the point, his solution to this little tension in his household was to sell this woman. That's what he's doing here. one young woman that was exhumed, 16 to 18 years old, was found without a coffin. Her arms were over, this is unique, her arms were over her head like this. She had this charm in a pouch at her hip. This is unlike anything that I've ever seen recorded in the archaeological literature. And I'm ending my talk with this image because I want to make the point that our years of analysis revealed so much about the people buried here at this site, but they keep some secrets still. And I think it reminds us that so much in their lives was kept secret for very good reasons. And on behalf of our huge research team and my colleagues, who I love dearly, I just want to thank you for helping commemorate the 15th anniversary of the reburial. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jean. I mean, I could have listened to Jean all night. I forgot to mention that I met Jean in archaeology field school at NYU, and without a doubt, I learned as much from Jean as I did from, well, I don't know if I can say our beloved professor, but he was known as the father of New York archaeology. He once ran for president of the United States under the Communist Party. Some people said he was quite a character, but he was also known as the father of New York archaeology. And he died just before the excavation took place, and I always have to think that there might have been a different outcome, because one thing about him was, his name was Bert Salwin, he was meticulous in everything he did regarding any archaeological site. So thank you so much, Jean. I do want to mention, because maybe people don't know, besides H.W., we don't know the name of a single individual in the burial ground. As I said, Jean and I, the people at John Street Methodist Church, were very generous with us in letting us look at their records from that period, which happened to be on microfiche, and at the time microfiche was being phased out, but one of their board members or trustees or something like that was a lawyer in the area, and he gave us access, and we never found anything definitive in terms of a name. We found things that said John was buried in the cemetery, but we have no idea if it's this cemetery or the John Street Methodist or any other cemetery. It's pretty clear that probably when the person wrote it, they knew which cemetery they were talking about, but it would be totally conjecture for us to even try to, guess it. But those are the only written records we've ever come across of people living at the time in the area. And no doubt some of them are in the cemetery. And, maybe someday we will know more. Thank you so much, Jean.
Once the AME Church was established, did they keep any records?
Their records were burned up. They were, however, the AME Church was where New York Law School sits today, and they were fined repeatedly by the city for burying people underneath the church. And in the summertime, you could imagine the smells coming from the church. And then the neighbors were very upset about the smells. And according to the records of the city of New York, they then began to bury their dead in Washington Square Park. So it's very clearly documented that in addition to burying the dead underneath the church there, and right across the street from the church was Freedom's Journal, their early offices. This is one of the reasons that the area was, as I told that reporter before I hung up the phone, this was known as Little Africa during that 18th century period. We want to stay on time, so I am pleased to introduce Dr. Fatima Jackson. She is trained as a human biologist. She's published extensively in such journals as Human Biology, Biochemical Medicine, and Metabolic Biology.
You don't have to read all
Should I
that.
read all?
No. There's too
Okay,
much to read.
I know, because I'm about to say, I can read this, but I don't know what it means, okay? So it's up to you, to tell us.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Wilson, and welcome everyone. So I'm taking a little different stance because although I served as director of genetics in the original group, we really didn't have a chance to do a lot of genetic work because the technology wasn't there. Now we have that capability. And a lot of the conflicts and concerns that we had 15 years ago, we're able to resolve because we have now molecular genetic information. For example, we're able to molecularly sex some of the juveniles and tell if they were male or female. We just look for the mark of the Y chromosome. We have a surprise when we've looked at a subsample and with their colleagues at the University of Copenhagen, and we find surprisingly that a large number of the individuals in the burial ground were women, and it kind of surprises us. And it a few cases it contradicts what the skeletal biology tells us. So that just makes for more interesting stories. And the other thing is that we are beginning to identify some of the individuals that we thought were not African American, like 101, with the Sankofa image, and there was a lot of controversy, and some skeletal biologists told us, oh, this is clearly a European American or European person, but when we did the mitochondrial DNA testing, clearly his mama was African. So, and his mitochondrial DNA was clearly out of Africa in the L mega haplogroup. So I'll just get started quickly to go through my slides, and I'm going to be talking about the continuing research that we're doing at Howard University on the burial ground. So it's an extension of what has already been done, amplifying what has been done, clarifying sometimes, and sometimes going in brand new directions with the small remnants that we have of the burial ground stored at Howard University. So I am directing the W. Montague Cobb Research Laboratory. It was founded in 1931 by William Montague Cobb. It's an interdisciplinary research unit. We just moved to a brand new building, so I'm happy about that. And we have great laboratory facilities there, which we're just beginning to use, like clean rooms and so forth, so that we can extract DNA without the problem of contamination. Because that's the big deal. You do all this effort to extract DNA, and you sequence it, and lo and behold, you just have your own DNA, not the DNA of the person you're trying, the African burial ground individual you were trying to study. Because we do a lot of interdisciplinary work, it really is a magnet for students from arts and sciences, from dentistry, from medicine, from allied health, from engineering, from computer sciences. We're getting a lot of people and working with us, and that's good because I think the best research is interdisciplinary research. We also do regular community outreach because it's Howard University, and you have to, if you don't keep the community happy, bad things happen. So you have to keep the community informed and engaged, and we try to do that several times a year, including in the summer, teaching K through 12 students. We have 3 unique collections now at the Cobb Research Lab. The New York African Burial Ground is the oldest, and we just have the remnant pieces, the archival material, and we have grave soil. And we have been working that grave soil to get some really good results, which I'll share with you. We have also the Cobb collection itself, which is 19th and 20th century African Americans from Washington, D.C. And then we just recently, like earlier this month, got 325 individuals from St. Helena's Island in the South Atlantic, where Napoleon was exiled. And these were Africans from the 1840s and 1830s who were on their way to enslavement in the Americas, got turned around by the British Navy and dropped off or dumped at St. Helena's Island. and 8,000 of them died there. About 20, 30,000 were sent to other places. If they survived that, they were sent to Jamaica, to Kingston, or they were sent to Cape Town. But the 8,000 that died, of those, 325 were excavated fairly recently as they were building an airport runway. So one of our students went there, negotiated with the government. We brought in Howard's lawyers, and we were able to bring back samples. So it's a huge a victory for the study of African and African American skeletal remains, because it fills that niche that we didn't really have 1840s, 1830s Africans who were on their way to slavery but had not yet been enslaved in the Americas. Okay, these are just us looking at some of the bones from the Cobb collection, and some of the students that work with us, and of course they look really happy. They're pretty happy because they're happy to see the skeletal remains, and these are again Cobb collection remains, 19th and 20th century individuals. This is why we say we have 400 years of African American biological history, because with the New York African Burial Ground we've got 17th, 18th, 19th, and 20th century. So pretty good. These are just some of the DNA assessments, and this is Dr. Latifah Jackson. I'm Fatima. That's Latifah Jackson. She's a computational biologist, but I make her do DNA extraction because everybody in my lab works. Everybody does everything. And then these are some of the outreach students in Tennessee, where a student is helping them, showing them how to extract DNA from a piece of fruit. And it's basically the same principle, but, you know, we're doing it from deceased individuals. Have to be a little bit more careful than if you're dealing with a strawberry, but same principle. So we're trying to build the next generation of scientists through this outreach effort. Now at the Montague Cobb Laboratory, we feel that we can create a new paradigm for understanding African American diversity. And we're collaborating with the National Park Service, which we're very grateful for, and we think through this collaboration, we've got the potential to really improve the foundational knowledge of African American human biological diversity and the historic presence in the Americas, and what did it mean to be in the Americas, to be enslaved in the Americas, and to finally be freed in the Americas. How did that change the background biology of African Americans? We think it can provide a template for advanced studies in these areas. And then our access to the burial ground has really allowed us to build on the work that has already been done, and as I said, elaborate on that work and sometimes take it in new directions. But it provides a systematic approach for understanding the structure and population biology of people of recent African descent. We think that this population, the New York African Burial Ground population, although the large proportion of the bodies are in the ground, but the remnants that we have to work with, because the science has improved, we can find out a lot just from those remnants. So it's not necessary to do the skeletal biology, but it still is necessary to do the genetics. And then with the genetics, we can then put that together with the skeletal biology. We don't necessarily need to do any more archaeology on it, although it would be great if we could have, but we can't do it now. But at least we can look at the grave soils, do the chemical analysis and elemental analysis of the grave sites, and then reconstruct what the lives of these people were like. So this is still very powerful, a very dramatic and important source of information. And for our public outreach effort, we are producing stories that are STEM, that is science, technology, engineering, and math infused stories about the people in the burial ground. We're just making up the stories. But you know, the stories are inspired by the people in the burial ground as a way of encouraging young people to identify with the people in the burial ground and see these people in the burial ground as having agency. And so we have stories like little medicine girl, where she goes and she's working delivering medicine for a yellow fever epidemic, but she ends up also resorting to medicines that she learned from a grandmother in Africa, presenting those to her own people. And it's that kind of tenacity that we want to encourage in the children who come here to see the burial ground, to see the National Monument. That's one of the stories. And so we've just sent 5 of those to you, and we've got 15 more to go to try to, again, provide a long-standing outreach for the many people and the generations of people who will be interested in this burial ground. These are just the research materials that we have available to us in the lab in general. Of course, some of these we have more of with the New York African Burial Ground than in other collections. We don't have clinical records, but we have skeletal, dental, grave soil, and DNA. And it'd be nice if we had clinical records and names, but we don't. But we can use the DNA to reconstruct the clinical records. So we can see molecular evidence of, say, something like yellow fever in the bones, in the DNA, and in the grave soil. So these are just some of the studies that are going on right now in the Cobb Research Lab from the New York African Burial Ground individuals. Here we're trying to identify where did these people come from in Africa, and what are their identities. Of course, we're not going to get names, but at least we can get regions of Africa that might be relevant. So we're using ancient DNA to identify the most likely point of origin for the Africans who were buried here, and then reconstruct how they may have gotten from that point in Africa to New York City or New Amsterdam. Another study is looking at the geospatial evidence of population substructure. This actually builds on the archaeological geospatial studies that have been done, but we're doing 3D studies to understand relationships between grave sites in the burial ground, and using the new molecular determinations of gender, we can then determine if some of those infants were male or female, some of those subadults. And when you have a mother buried with, or you have a woman buried with an infant, we assume that infant is somehow related to that mother. Maybe it's her baby. But what do you do when you have an adult male with an infant buried or a young child buried with him? That's pretty interesting. Or buried in close proximity. Are they related? And so again, we're plugging that information into the geographical information system analyses and looking for possible family groupings. So another, that's could be very promising. This is looking at the chemistry and microbiology of the grave soils, and the graduate student who's working on this is, we're hoping that he will finish his PhD actually next year, because he's moving right along. He's doing a great job, Carter Clinton, and he's been looking at the evidence for specific soil contaminants, microbes, and other factors that could have influenced the health and well-being of the New Yorkers, historic New Yorkers. He'll be coming on Saturday with 5 undergraduate students from Howard University who have been working with him, because our pattern at the lab is it's each one teach one. Because first of all, I don't have time to be handling all these people. So I have graduate students, and they're responsible for the undergraduates. So I'm the PI, the principal investigator. They're the project managers for their own individual projects. And then the undergraduates work with them. It's a kind of a hierarchical system, but it gives me some free time to do some thinking, and it gives the students, the graduate students, a chance to learn their managerial skills, which they're going to need if they're going to be faculty members. So I'm loving it. And the undergraduates are so happy because they get more hands-on experience than if they were trying to deal directly with me. And so Carter is coming with about 500 members of the freshman class at Howard University. That'll be Saturday. and they'll be going through the interpretive center, and hopefully some of our people will be adding to the messages that they get from the rangers. You know, because we want to work with you, and as soon as we get new information, turn that around to you, you know, in a way that's going to be palatable for the public. Because the public needs, you know, they're hungry. They want new information. They always want new information, and so we see that as our task. We're also looking at the relationship between genotype and phenotype in the burial ground, and it was really Burial 101 that got us started on this, because there was so much controversy. This is the man who was over 6 feet tall, who had supposedly a Sankofa image on. So everything about that burial was controversial. Remember? The image. Some people said, no, that's a heart, that's not a Sankofa. There's no, you know, back and forth. And then we had a skeletal biologist from France look at the skeletal remains, and he was sure, Dr. Froment, he was sure that that was a European, and said no way could the skeletal dimensions, you know, be representative of an African. Not understanding, it seems, that Africans come in all different shapes and sizes. And in fact, more genetic diversity and phenotypic diversity exists in Africans than in any other population. We're the tallest, the shortest, the biggest noses, the most narrow noses, straight hair, kinky hair, no hair. I mean, come on. So we've got a lot of variability, and that wasn't taken into the classical racial models. So now we did the molecular genetic assessment of this individual, and as I said, his mother clearly was African. So he was probably African. He was just a tall African. Okay. We want to look at the environmental factors. The idea here is that you have the coded genome, and then it passes, that is what the actual genome of the individual is from the DNA, and it passes through these filters to the expressed genotype, which is the phenotype, what you actually see. So how many of the people in the burial ground have a phenotype that looks a little bit different than their genotype because of the kinds of living conditions they were exposed to, the malnutrition, the disease, and so forth, you know? So we're kind of recreating what are these filters that the genotype from the DNA passes through to be expressed as proteins. We have, this is a little more esoteric, but we see the New York African Burial Ground as being a major source of information for a Center for African Genomic Diversity that we're trying to establish at Howard University. And I'm hoping that we'll be able to work with you, Dr. Gomez, because Dr. Gomez is a new director of an African Diaspora Center at NYU. So I'm hoping I can pull on our long-term friendship for help, because, you know, without good historians, then we can't just use the genetics by itself to tell the story. We have to have people trained in history to help us interpret the genetic information, you know? Otherwise, we're just making up stuff, you know? And so the genetic information will tell you that something happened, but can't tell you why it happened, or when it happened, or how it happened, see? So we need the historians in this interdisciplinary center. So we are hoping that we can start by talking about the genetic diversity in the New York African Burial Ground, then add to it the Cobb collection, then add to it now the St. Helens folks. And, you know, we have a pretty comprehensive 400-year history of our people's existence here. And, of course, we can not only look at the genetics, but we can look at something called the epigenetics. So these are the chemical tags that are in association with various genes or are generalized throughout the genome, and they will give you an indication of the kinds of environmental constraints that that individual may have faced, or his parents may have faced, or his grandparents may have faced. So the epigenome is increasingly important in understanding, you know, because the epigenome can change gene expression patterns. So you might have a gene to produce ABC protein, but instead you're going to produce ABF protein, that because the epigenome is giving you a different signal to the genome, telling the genome, no, don't make the usual protein you make a little bit different. And that may be a precursor for disease, or it may prevent a disease. There's just so many aspects to it. So it's not all just about the DNA. It's about all of the things that influence the DNA as well. And that we hope to really bring that in. That's the applied genetic and genomic studies, including pharmacogenomics, how you respond to various drugs, precision medicine, metabolomics, lots of fancy names, but simply saying that it's not just the simple have a gene, have a protein. It's much more complicated now, and we want to bring that sophistication to our studies of African and African American biological history. I made this diagram for the dean of the medical school, because a lot of physicians think they know everything. And, I'm trying to say, no. PhDs know some things, too. And so he said, we're going to do this precision medicine and pharmacogenomics and metabolomics, all this stuff. And I said to him, not unless you know ancestry. That understanding ancestry, that's the foundational piece. And then from that, you begin to look at all these fancy dancy genetics. But if you don't have the ancestry down, you don't have anything, because our ancestry is unique. And we're coming up primarily out of Africa with modest gene flow from non-Africans. That's a pretty unique combination. It needs to be studied independently. We can't take the norms from European ancestry and apply them to us and have a good outcome up in the leaves. The ancestry in the trunk of the tree is extremely important. This is a project that I'm working on with Dr. Latifah Jackson. And yes, I told you she's my daughter. So in my family, my husband and I are both professors. And we told our kids that if they didn't get advanced degrees, then at Thanksgiving they had to sit at the children's table. So, yeah, so for some reason they've gone and gotten degrees, and I love it, because we got a GIS specialist, we have an anesthesiologist, we've got a couple of people with business degrees, and Latifah is a computational biologist. So she's handling all our big data. Now, big data is absolutely essential to figure out what the heck is going on, because this is beyond what we can do on our handheld computers. It's big data looking at the patterns of variability in Africa, and then how those patterns transfer to the Americas. And, it's a project that will outlive me, but we want to get started on it, developing mathematical and ecological models for African genomic diversity. And Africa has still not been adequately studied in terms of its genetics. And until we understand Africa, we don't understand Homo sapiens, because that's where we originate. So understanding African diversity is really prime. And you can't, and this is a lot to take in here, but what we did was we looked at the ecological diversity in Africa, then superimposed on that the regions of the different ethnic groups, the geographical regions, the space that they occupy. And what we found when we did a regression analysis was that the ecological diversity is highly correlated with the patterns of ethnic diversity, which we think is also correlated with patterns of genetic diversity. Now, it's a hypothesis that we need to test, but what we're saying is that if most of the Africans that were brought to the Americas came from West and West Central Africa, there should be a lot of variation in us, and because of the regions that we came from that were highly diverse, from savanna and tropical rainforest regions and Sahel regions. So anyway, this is something that we're working on, and the burial ground is important because, remember I said one of the things we want to do is determine where did those Africans come from. And so that will give us information on what Africa was like at that time, what the genetic diversity looked like. Oops. Okay, so in summary, these are just 6 of the main projects that we're working on: environmental sources of genotype-phenotype discontinuity, mathematical and ecological modeling, African identities of New York Africans, geospatial evidence of population substructure in the burial ground itself, using the burial ground information to help establish a Center for African Genomic Diversity, and then looking at the chemistry and microbiology of the grave soils. And because the grave soils it's soil from the decomposed flesh of the people who were buried there. It's really sacred soil. And when you think about it, this is not, soil you just buy at Home Depot. This is soil that has become ashes to ashes, dust to dust, and here it's in our hand. And as we've sifted through it, we found remnants of hair, sometimes some buttons we find in the soil. And we know from what part of the body the soil was coming, so we can compare soil from the head versus soil from the abdominal area. And that's, of course, important because if the person died from an abdominal disorder, maybe we'll find that pathogen in the soil. So lots of opportunities, lots of people helping us, and this is just a partial listing of some of the people, but I'd like to particularly thank Superintendent McKinney because she's been with us since then. I've been begging you for money. Like, how many years has it been? I even call you long distance. Could I please have some money? Don't you owe me some money? No, but lots of people coming through, and now people are starting to get PhDs based upon their research with the burial ground. So my concluding slide is just to thank our colleagues at National Park Service. We are grateful to you, and we hope for a continued relationship. Okay, thank you all. Thank you all.
Thank you, Dr. Jackson. I mean, every time I hear this, it's so eye-opening. When people talk about, and I'm teaching undergraduate students, and most of them have never heard of the one-drop theory. So when you think about the one-drop theory, like racism itself, or race as a social construct, your research is taking us on, again, an eye-opening path that needs to be followed. And
Change the whole paradigm.
yes, we can.
Maybe everybody out.
Absolutely. Well, I mean, it's always said that that's where we are from. We're all from Africa.
One drop.
Okay, one drop, okay? Okay, Dr. Michael Gomez, our historian, is currently Silver Professor of History in Middle Eastern and Islamic Studies at New York University, having served as the founding director of the Association for the Study of Worldwide African Diaspora from its inception in 2000 to 2007. He has chaired of the history departments he has chaired history departments at both NYU and Spelman College, and has served as president of UNESCO's International Scientific Committee for the Slave Route Project from 2009 to 2011. He is the author of quite a few books, including Pragmatism in the Age of Jihad, the Pre-Colonial State of Bunda, Exchanging Our Country Marks, the Transformation of African Identities in the Colonial and Antebellum South, Reversing Sale, A History of the African Diaspora. And another book I'd like to mention, Black Crescent, African Muslims in the Americas. Dr. Michael Gomez.
Thank you very much, Dr. Wilson, for your invitation, and I want to thank everyone for coming out. And this has been really a fascinating session thus far. I've learned so much, and there's so much more to learn. I I had some involvement with the African Burial Ground. In fact, that's where I met Professor Fatima Jackson, and it was for me, though my experience involvement was limited. It was very difficult because it was a learning experience, because just learning how to work with people, historians don't do that too well. And at one point, my assignment was simply to go and do the research and then turn everything over to others, and that was kind of difficult for me. So I'm going to just provide a bit of an overview of provide a kind of context for what's been discussed from the perspective of the archaeologists and the scientists and so forth. And I am mindful of the fact that we're really talking about, with respect to the transatlantic slave trade, which begins in the 15th century, from my perspective, we're really talking about the beginning, the dawn of modernity, that is. And by modernity, I have in mind precisely the series of social and cultural economic relationships which tend to govern the world into the present day. From my analysis, this all begins with the transatlantic slave trade. That is to say, with the transatlantic slave trade, we begin to see a refashioning of definitions of race and gender, class, and so forth, all of which came about as a consequence of this trade. So the early African presence in the Americas, I'm going to read if you don't mind. This is what I do. I won't read a lot, but the early African presence in the Americas was but the beginning of woes. The export figure remains a matter of debate, with some arguing for estimates that trend upward toward 100 million, including losses in Africa. The scholarly consensus, however, seems to be settling over this 12.5 million figure, that 12.5 million Africans were exported from Africa, out of which 10.7 million arrived alive, which translates into a loss of about 15% during the Middle Passage. Nearly 65% of the total were males, and at least 26% prepubescent children. The transatlantic trade would span some 400 years, from the 15th through the 19th centuries. Nearly 60% of all of the Africans imported into the Americas made the voyage between 1721 and 1820, while 82% were transported between 1701 and 1850. This was originally referred to as the Du Bois database. Possibly most of you are familiar with it, but I would like to actually, I had in mind that I was going to try to manipulate it a little bit, but I don't think that I'll have that opportunity. But this is a really wonderful resource for studying this transatlantic trade in human beings. And this has over 36,000 slaving voyages, and in some detail. It will tell you the ports of embarkation, disembarkation, how many Africans were involved, where they came from, and so forth, the length of the voyages and so forth. It's really a wonderful tool. I was speaking with someone who is directly involved in maintaining this site. And one of the aspects of this that we don't know a lot about, or we need to know more about, concerns the transshipment of Africans from one site in the Americas to the other. So people may come into the Caribbean, but they may not necessarily stay there. And and this is a new dimension of the site that will be up. My understanding is within a couple of months. So we'll see how that goes. Of all of the voyages, excuse me, for which there is data between 1501 and 1866, some 88% of these captive Africans wound up in Brazil and the Caribbean, including Cuba and Puerto Rico. Indeed, Brazil alone imported 45% of the total trade. That part of the Caribbean in which the English and French languages became dominant, yet transformed through African inflections, syntaxes, and vocabularies, received 32% of the total. The so-called British Caribbean, taking in twice as many as the French, Spanish claimed lands accounted for 12% of the Africans, with Cuba alone receiving 7% of the trade, after which North America took in less than 4%. Approximately 83% of those exported through the Atlantic came from one of four regions: West Central Africa, 45%, the Bight of Benin or Benin, 16%, the Bight of Biafra, 13%, and the Gold Coast, 9%. Captives from West Central Africa. This is very interesting because we talk about Africans, but the story as we delve into it is very interesting in that different communities would arrive in different places, and that is, and it helps to explain the ways in which we both converge and diverge. And so we should understand these communities not simply because they were English or French or Portuguese or Spanish claim, but also the particular mix of Africans coming from the continent differed from place to place. Captives from West Central Africa, what we now call Congo, Angola, comprised 43% of those who disembarked in Saint-Domingue, what is presently called Haiti. 40% of those brought to Spanish America received an astounding 70%. 40% of those brought to Spanish America came from West Central Africa, and an astounding 70% of all Africans coming into Brazil came from West Central Africa. The Bight of Benin, in turn, was a significant contributor to Bahia and Pernambuco in northeastern Brazil, as well as the French Caribbean, accounting for 30% of all Africans brought to northern Brazil. As for what would become the British Caribbean, 26% of all Africans came from Gold Coast. We've heard about that. But what's interesting is that even more, some 32%, will come from the Bight of Biafra. Now, this is very fascinating because when we talk about, in particular, places like Jamaica, there's a lot about Gold Coast, so-called Gold Coast Africans, Cromanti, so forth. And you very rarely, if ever, hear anything about Igbo, Ibibio, or Fik, people coming from what is now southeastern Nigeria. But in fact, more of them were in Jamaica than came from the Gold Coast. So so it becomes important to parlay this kind of information into how we remember and how we construct and how we organize information about these populations. As yet another illustration of how these patterns could differ from location to location, the Senegambian total contribution of 6% to the trade obscures its contribution in what becomes the United States. In the United States, Senegambians contributed 24% of the Africans who come here. So a quarter of all of the Africans coming here were from Senegambia, and this specific demographic pattern is crucial to understanding the unfolding of cultural expressions and political developments in North America, because Senegambia was a region long associated with Islam. It becomes increasingly Muslim as the 18th century progresses, and these are the populations, these are the communities out of which people are coming into this place. So I segue because I want to talk about the African Muslim experience. It is an interesting one. What develops in North America, the core of the African Muslim population, it appears, was in coastal Georgia, South Carolina. But there were Muslims here as well. But with respect to, that is to say, in New York and in the along the northeastern littoral, the experience of Europeans with African Muslims was pretty extensive, pretty long. Begins at least with the Iberian, with the histories of Iberia in 711, Muslims moving into Iberia in 711. It helps us to explain how the experience in places like Brazil and Latin America, where people from what becomes Portugal and Spain had a much longer interaction with Muslims than in a place like New York. In a place like New York, this was relatively new. The area to which Henry Hudson first arrived in 1609, called New Netherlands as early as 1614, brings these these various European communities, including the French-speaking Walloons and so forth, to Manhattan or New Amsterdam, 1624. The English seized the colony in 1664. And there are a variety of many different European groups which come to this place. Between 1638 and 1648, some 18 European languages are spoken in New Amsterdam, or what becomes later on New York. At some point in 1625 or 1626, the first Africans arrive in New Amsterdam. These people apparently were, for the most part, from West Central Africa, Congo, Angola, and so forth. It's interesting that they bear the names of these places: Paulo, Angola, Simon, Congo, and so forth. This is very interesting to me because this is the early 17th century, and a number of the polities that developed, a number of these polities developed later in Congo and Angola. So, but at any rate, you have these people coming in. Some of them, they have different statuses. Some of them are indentured. Some of them are enslaved. In 1628, 3 enslaved African women were imported into the area. And I'm skipping over some information here. Some of them have the opportunity to purchase what would be called half freedom. Some of them will be able to achieve full freedom, and so forth. So you have a heterogeneous African descendant population developing here in New York. People arriving from West and West Central Africa, as well as from the Caribbean. One of the most prominent among them was this fellow named Anthony Jansen van Salé, also known as Anthony Jansen van Wijs. He was called Anthony the Turk. And this notion of the Turk was commonly applied to North Africans at the time. Property records would continue to refer to the land bearing his name as, quote unquote, the Turk's land. Anthony was described as a mulatto, noted for his size and strength. And it would appear that he was born in the seaport town of Salé in North Africa. And his mother, apparently was West African, from what I can determine. He was considered to be a quote-unquote Mohammedan at the time. And he would come to this place. He would marry an interesting woman. They would always be a European woman. They would always be at loggerheads with their surroundings, in particular They had a series of conflicts and confrontations with a particular Dutch minister in the early 17th century. Of approximately 50 civil suits and 43 criminal cases argued before the colonial court between 1638 and 1639, Anthony and his wife were very prominent in most of them. And this is an interesting example of someone who was North African and Muslim, and it suggests that we need to kind of widen the aperture in terms of understanding the African Muslim population which comes into North America, because not everyone came from West Africa. You had a number of people who also came from North Africa itself. In 1739, the couple were branded as troublesome persons. They were given 6 months to leave New Netherlands forever. And so what happened was they were able to negotiate that. They settled in Long Island, bought 200 acres of land. They pioneered the towns of Utrecht and Gravesend. Anthony went on to become one of the largest and most prominent landowners in Long Island. He also bought a house on Bridge Street in New Amsterdam as early as 1643. He became a merchant and creditor within New Amsterdam. Anyway, the study continues on with his descendants. His lifelong difficulties may be attributable to his personality or to economic rivalries and jealousies. However, his Muslim North African background cannot be discounted as a factor in neither his. He had a very defiant attitude toward authority, particularly the Dutch Church, and so this may have been a factor. One of his descendants would later sell, and I've been trying to track down this because there are rumors that it's still around. But a descendant of his would later sell a, quote, beautiful copy of the Quran. And so it is very probable that Anthony and others made attempts to continue to pursue Islam in this place. When we get to the English period, the evidence for Muslims in New York becomes indirect, speculative. Between 1700 and 1774, at least 6,800 enslaved persons were imported into New York City, over 41% of whom were African-born. Before 1742, 70% came from the West Indies, particularly from Barbados and Jamaica. A minority would come directly from Africa. After 1742, the relative percentages were reversed, so that 70% would come from Africa between 1750 and 1756. New York City became a regular port of call for this trade. The demographics reflect these changes. At the beginning of the 18th century, 14.5% of the city's population was of African descent, a figure that peaked in 1746 at 20.8%. In addition to loading and unloading cargo at the docks, slips, and warehouses along the East River, slaves worked in the shipbuilding and construction industries and ferried between Long Island farms and the city, engaged in any number of public work projects and domestic services. They were especially skillful in the marketplace, with so many selling produce in the city streets that the Common Council had to curb their activities in 1740. The sources tend to be rather unspecific with regard to the supply areas in West Africa from which captives were taken, coming to this place. One can assume that there must have been a modicum of Muslims among them, but there are only anecdotal and indirect references to support this. The relationship between New York and West Africa, of course, dates back to the Dutch, who in 1617 purchased, quote-unquote, Gorée Island off of, outside of Dakar from the natives, quote-unquote, and proceeded to build 2 small forts there in addition to establishing a presence at Rufisque on the mainland. Although there is nothing to suggest that the Dutch recruited heavily from Senegambia or Gorée, some Senegambians must have filtered into New Amsterdam. For the English period, however, there are instances in which Senegambia is specifically cited as the source of captives. For example, about 500 Africans, quote, many of them directly from Gambia, unquote, were transported into the area in 1762, at the peak of that city's participation in the slave trade. And so I just go through examples of people who are from Gambia, from Senegambia, so forth, per the newspapers of the period. The background of the legendary Ira Aldrich, the luminary Shakespearean actor and thespian of the Africa Company, whose performances were held at the African Grove at the corner of Bleecker and Mercer Streets, may also include a Senegambian heritage. He was born in July of 1807, and he was the son of Daniel Eldridge, who purported to be the son of a Senegalese chief. So this is difficult to verify this, but it at least demonstrates that there was some sensibility, some Muslim sensibility in the city. It is also reasonable to speculate that names associated with Africans could reflect a Muslim identity. The name Sambo or Samba, for example, this is a Pular name. This is a name for the Halpular and the speakers of Pular, the so-called Fulani, Fula. This is a name which means second son in the Pular language. So a number of people so designated may have been of Fulbe origin. Now this name becomes caricatured later on to mean something very different. But the name was very popular in the New York area, and I'm not so sure that the term had been caricatured by the 18th century. And so I go on and talk about the various individuals who have this name. But West Africa may not have been the only region from which most Muslims came to New York City. Some could have also come out of the Madagascar trade, with which New York had extensive involvement. Captives from the Madagascar sector arrived in North America in 2 brief spans of time, from the 1670s to 1698, when the lucrative trade was halted by an act of Parliament, and for 5 years between 1716 and 1721, after which the legal trade was terminated. While most of those exported from Madagascar were non-Muslim, some were Muslim, evidence for which is admittedly, this evidence is admittedly speculative, but it comes from what we know about Madagascar in the 17th and 18th centuries. This information is not new. It's very interesting, though, because scholars of the slave trade don't discuss it. Islam moves into Madagascar as early as the 12th century, if not sooner. It was very much associated with foreign domination, amalgamations of various sorts, and trafficking. Sometime after the beginning of the 16th century, yet another group would move into Madagascar from the Swahili coast. And this group coming in, was decidedly Muslim and literate. They were called the Silamu, which means Muslims by the Malagasy. And some of them were called the Antimoru. The Antimoru will compose what were called the sacred books, the Sorabe, which employs an Arabic script for the Malagasy language, and so forth. So I get into this discussion, building a case for understanding Islam in Madagascar during this period in time. And what's interesting is that there are many, many references to the Malagasy in New York, especially in the runaway slave ads. These tend to focus on the divergent phenotype of the Malagasy. Thus, in July of 1734, one James Thompson of Piscataway, New Jersey, reported, quote, reported missing, quote, a lusty Madagascar man of yellowish complexion who talks good English. In May of 1749, Samuel Morse and Francis Bloodgood of Woodbridge, New Jersey, also sought the return of Mando, a, quote, young black fellow who had absconded with a 40-year-old, quote, yellow Madagascar fellow named Tom. Such was the association of yellowness with the Malagasy that a fellow named Aaron Bratt of Schenectady described in October of 1735 his runaway indentured servant, William Smith, as appearing, quote, in color like the Madagascar. Finally, John Willett Jr. of Flushing published a notice in the May 19, 1746 edition of the New York Weekly Journal, in which he discussed 21-year-old Primus, who, quote, alters his name frequently. He is about 6 feet tall and well-proportioned. He is of a Malagasco complexion, and is observed that he will lie, so that he is not to be believed or depended upon in that respect. I go on and on talking about the various evidence, but I'll end here by a brief consideration of the Amistad. Now, the Amistad, as you know, this takes place in 1839. It does bring us back to some extent to a focus on New York, as the post-mutinous ship drifted near Long Island in August of that year before being commandeered by the U.S. Navy later that month. Of the 36 Africans brought to port in New London, Connecticut, at least one was unquestionably Muslim. And he was described as someone in whose country the people could read and write from right to left in Arabic. The others were Mende, so it's probable that many more were Muslim. While their return to West Africa prevented any organic contribution to subsequent Muslim communities in North America, their experience and example certainly fired the imagination of all those left behind to struggle for freedom. And then this study moves into trying to make a connection between what's happening in places like South Carolina and Georgia and New York in the 17th and 18th century with subsequent developments in the American Muslim community. Thank you very much.
Dr. Gomez, thank you for giving us that glimpse into 17th century African Muslim life in New York, as well as the origins of various individuals. Fascinating. Questions, everyone?
I have a question and a comment, because I took so many notes on what you were saying, but what you've laid out helps explain or could contribute to our understanding of a number of things related to the burial ground. For example, the orientation of the burials with the head in the west. If it wasn't being practiced by Christians at that time, the influence, because Muslims have very clear ideas about burials, and these are well established. So it's possible that the inspiration for the orientation could have come from the Muslims. We know from Sylvia Duff's book on American Muslims, African American Muslims, and that many African Muslims kind of went underground practicing their religion, because it was a period of enslavement. Dr. Gomez's insights really helped to flesh out who we were, who we've come from, and how our ancestors pulled on a variety of resources to, in fact, develop resilience. I think that that's very important. I mean, we know that again, from Sylvia and Duff's books, that sometimes the Muslims were the ones to say to the non-Muslim Africans, don't worry, the person they're talking about is Isa alayhi salam, Jesus. It's okay, calm down. Maybe that was in your book. I've read so many of your books, it's all floating around in my mind. But the Madagascar connection is important because sometimes when we do the genetic testing of African Americans, we pick up a Southeast Asia signal and we don't know where it's coming from. And we say, like when we use the program structure, and when you have a N of 13, then we get 13 different groups. Well, so for African Americans, there's a small little segment that looks Southeast Asian. Well, the peopling of Madagascar was people from Southeast Asia and from Africa. So it's very possible that in fact we're carrying some of that lineage as a result of the slave trade. You know, we got it legally, but it's because of the vastness of and the opportunism of slavery that the people were picking up Africans and potential slaves anywhere they could pick them up. Anyway, I just wanted to say that this shows the importance of working together, multiple disciplines, working together. We can tell a much more complex and interesting story.
Can I ask you a question? This is really interesting in sort of trying to think about what is the interaction between the transatlantic trade in enslaved people and the trans-Indian Ocean trade in enslaved people, and how those two diaspora generating events actually potentially intersect in Mozambique, in Madagascar, and potentially then bring in types that we're seeing in the genetic literature that are heretofore unexplained. So,
Right.
like you were saying, the Southeast Asian,
Right.
but also the Indian subcontinent types, and and some even Austronesian and Melanesian types. But I'm sorry. So what I was asking was, what do you think the relationship between these two trade and enslaved peoples was, and you don't think there's any crosstalk between them?
Yes, there were cross currents, and in particular in the ocean, because, sorry, I'm sorry. In particular in the Indian Ocean, 18th and 19th centuries, no? And so from, once Vasco da Gama does his thing in 1498 in Kilwa and bombards the city. I was just speaking with an archaeologist who works in Kilwa, and was talking about the fact that people are still living in Kilwa. Yeah, they're still there, even though the Portuguese destroyed the city. But from that point forward, you have a kind of integration of these commercial forces and networks, so that individuals who are usually captured in the interior of the East African littoral could find themselves in any number of places. They could be taken into the Indian Ocean trade. They could find themselves in the Persian Gulf area, or they could be taken around the Cape of Good Hope and into the Americas. I mean, it could wind up in any number of places. It's very interesting because there's this there's a scholar of Mexican history. I forget his name, but he went into he delved into he attempted to delve into the ethnicities of the Afro-Mexican population in the 16th century, and many of those people were from East Africa. Many of the names are Swahili names.
And they're centered in Veracruz, is that right?
Well, I'm not sure where they were centered at in the 16th century. Now yeah.
Yes.
But if I'm not mistaken, I think a number of those people were brought into Mexico City. But this is 16th, 17th century.
Yes.
Yeah, and and so that's just an illustration of the variability and the unpredictability, even with the West Coast. Even with the slave trade out of West Africa, that trading posts went well into Mauritania. So you had Africans coming out of various barracoons or trading posts, going all the way into Mauritania. Could find themselves, any place anywhere in the Americas, or they could find themselves in North Africa or elsewhere in the Mediterranean. So yeah. So, but I think the Indian Ocean trade, and there's a similar project underway trying to come up with a similar kind of database for the Indian Ocean trade as we have for the transatlantic trade. Europeans tended to keep much better records, than populations in the Indian Ocean. But yeah, so.
Are there other questions? Yes. Yes, sir.
Hi. Thank you very much for your presentation. It's just amazing across the board. My name is Wally Idris Abdullah. I'm the Executive Director of African News Organization. I'm particularly interested in Dr. Jackson's presentation regarding your mention of I would say, relationship or juxtaposition between phenotypes and genotypes. I wonder how far you are in that study and how far you can take it, and what are the elements that you are actually looking at in order to explicate the scenario of how you relate to the African experience.
So we're actively working on this. For example, we just published with Dr. Latifah Jackson and then one of my daughter-in-laws, Zainab Jackson. It's a three Jackson
A lot of
thing.
Jacksons.
A lot of Jacksons up in here. But we just published 2 papers in the Journal of Clinical Epigenetics that look at epigenetic changes associated with chattel slavery and institutionalized racism. We're really happy about these papers because we're trying to look at what does it mean to have ancestry where you've gone through this legacy of enslavement, and it's not a trivial thing. It's not a few years. We're talking about hundreds of years, at least 16 generations of exposure. So what are the kinds of epigenetic changes might we have experienced? And so we published those 2 in the third paper. The first paper talked about the developmental stages, the kinds of changes that would be instituted at different developmental stages from birth to adulthood and senescence. The second paper is really talking about resilience, because we don't want to leave the story with, you really did us wrong, you did us so bad. No, we want to say, yeah, but look at us, we're surviving. We have resilience. Yeah, right. So, yeah, we made LeBron. So then now, the third paper, we want to look at the torture devices, because the devices themselves have an impact. If you're stressing various parts of the body, then that's going to have an impact. Because remember, the epigenetics is passed on for at least 4 generations. So old people like me probably are still carrying some markers from my ancestors who were enslaved. Maybe old people like both of us.
Yeah,
right?
that's right. That's right. That's right. That's right.
Yeah, all of us. So really important, because that means that they're still influencing gene expression patterns. So you could have a genotype that looks very similar to somebody from West Africa, but have a phenotype like that controls disease susceptibility or something like that, that's actually quite distinct, simply because of the legacy of slavery. So we've even started trying to distinguish between those African Americans who've gone through this experience versus those who just arrived, a couple of weeks ago from Nigeria. They're all classified as African Americans in the kind of generic census and insensitive census categories, but the legacy African Americans may have the additional burden of slavery that the Africans coming have the burden of colonialism, but colonialism in your own home might be a little bit different than enslavement in New York, where you're a minority. So that's kind of some of the work that we're doing with it, and we'll continue looking at those environmental factors that filter the genetic message, because I think that that's going to be very informative to quantify the environmental factors. And right now, for most geneticists, the environment is a big black box, and that's not a good thing. It's just a big unknown, And yet we know about our history and we know about our culture, so we're in the best position to talk about the environmental influences. So that's where we're at. And we would appreciate collaborators. So if you're at all interested, please give us a little help. Give the sister a little help here.
Okay, Doris, I think you're our last question, unfortunately. Okay.
Now, my grandmother was born in Antigua, but my grandfather came from Sudan, Juba.
Oh, from Cuba, okay.
I don't have sickle cell, but I do have Italian anemia.
You don't have sickle cell, but you have what?
They say I have anemia that only Italians.
Oh, no. Anemia. Mm.
Oh, alpha thalassemia, G6PD. I don't know, Italians have a lot of stuff, including sickle cell, because they have a frequency of sickle cell that's higher than some areas of Africa. Look, genes don't care what so-called race you are. Genes are trying to promote themselves,
Or what your phenotype is.
Yeah.
Yes,
So the
absolutely.
gene doesn't care. The gene is hoping that it lands in somebody who's high status and very fertile, so the gene can replicate itself. So yes, so there's no such thing as an Italian gene. There's not even an African gene. There are frequencies of certain genes that are higher frequency in certain parts of Africa than in other parts of Africa. But there's not even one gene that's uniform throughout all of Africa. And we should say to that one, thank God. Thank God.
Okay, we've got.
You said that in 1989 you were asked to assess the archaeological potential of this site. By whom and for what purpose? Were people thinking beforehand to not allow construction here?
No, it was just, it's just a regulatory thing that has to be done. For a federal project, you have to do environmental background studies. That's all.
Based on the 1966 Historic Preservation Law.
It's
Because,
regulatory.
for example, I remember talking to the engineer that was supposed to be around when 26 Federal Plaza was built, and I asked him were there remains, and of course, his story was, oh, absolutely not.
Yeah, right.
And he stuck to that story the whole time I knew him. But there was no legal requirement for excavation there. And, I don't believe him. I told him that it just seems like there's, I don't think this burial ground was that isolated in terms of a street. I believe that they discovered, like the subway, that human remains were discovered, but people, they weren't required to do anything about it, and they tried to hush it up and build whatever they were building right away.
I was in that building when they were building it, and there's so many people died of cancer in that one building. I'm telling you, males too. Many of them had breast cancer.
Awesome.
Yes.
Thank you
Sir.
so much. We really appreciate being here. My name is Malik Khan, working for the Gore Memorial in Senegal. Many of you know about Gore Island. I used to be also a volunteer here at the burial grounds. It's my occasion to thank so much the superintendent here, Sheree. So my question is, we're talking about the African presence in the Americas. So I'm reading a book interested in documenting the African presence before Columbus here in the Americas. I don't know if you know, like Professor Patejan, he was talking about a lot of people who used to sail from West Africa to the Americas, and you know, a lot of information going on. I don't know, what do you think about this thesis? And the second one is, when I was here in the burial ground, they used to say that 13% of the human remains of all the database we have here are Muslim, African Muslim. Can you confirm that? These are my two questions.
Well, I can speak to the first very quickly. There's a lot of controversy over that. And it was most famously promulgated by Van Sertima, and the late Dr. Van Sertima. And what's interesting about that, so the thesis rests on two categories of information. One has to do with the number of artifacts and visuals that you find in South America. Latin American scholars have fought very, very hard against this thesis. Okay, so that is an ongoing battle. The other side of it has to do with a story that Mansa Musa told in Cairo during Hajj. He talked about his predecessor sending thousands of ships west. It's a complicated story. And I think I'm probably agnostic when it comes to this story, because it could have happened. We can't demonstrate that it happened, but it's very probable. One of the things about the story is that in the account that Musa tells, one of the commanders of the ships comes back and he says, we were headed west and we ran into this river in the Atlantic, and it's clear that he's talking about the Canary Current. So they had to be out there in order to experience that. So something happened. Now, did all of those Africans wind up in Central America? We don't know. But that's the thesis, is that that's probably what happened, that these people actually made the trip and stayed there. And so I don't know. It's possible.
We're getting closer to
How
some
about the
engineering
13%?
work that is shedding light on this question about whether all of the native populations came over the Atlantic.
The timeline is off.
Yeah, but the timeline is off,
Timeline.
exactly. So the question is also, there's a lot of speculation that there is a Polynesian population that is deposited in southern Argentina.
Yes.
And then moves north as you have this ice bridge population coming south, and that they're actually meeting somewhere in the middle. And so there are ways to test for that, but we don't have good sampling across the native populations of South America.
So, but ideally, I guess if we're saying they're meeting somewhere in the middle, we're talking about the Caribbean, maybe
In South
Central
America.
America. Yeah.
They're in South
It's
America.
probably the
Northern part of South
Right.
America.
Because they're going, there's like a very narrow corridor for them to go
Yeah.
on the western side of the Andes.
Yes, yes.
But the bulk of the African people here in the Americas came as a result of the trade in enslaved Africans. Because I know that in the community, in our communities, there's a lot of talk about, oh no, we're indigenous. And then I say, well, where's the evidence? Then they bring me a helmeted Olmec statue.
Right,
And it's,
right.
look, we got to stop thinking that every big-headed, big-nosed person is African. Because in fact, to be human for the longest period of time was to be African. So every time we see somebody that reminds us of what we look like, It doesn't necessarily mean that they're genetically from the same place recently that we're from. The African phenotype should show up in Melanesia, in Micronesia, in South Asia. It should show up in all human populations. In fact, the big question is the people who don't look very African. And they're the product of isolation and endogamy. They're on the periphery of the normal human range, the regular human range. So we've got to change our thinking, because the thinking has been so Eurocentric that we're surprised when we find somebody that looks like us. We think that they must be a part of us, you know, not understanding that the phenotypes that we're showing are in fact the common phenotype for our species. I mean, that's really important, but it's only going to change with data, you know, because there's always going to be that pushback because of the centuries of Eurocentrism and the notion of European as norm. But we're changing that as we understand about human evolution.
How about the 13% in the burial ground? Muslim, 13%.
Of the number of people in the burial grounds, the number of Muslims in the burial ground.
Yeah,
The answer.
it's highly speculative.
Highly
Yeah.
speculative, yes. And it really cannot be answered so far based on the research. I'd like to thank everyone for coming, including those 30 who were turned away.
Turned
We're going to
away.
have them back. And
Terrible.
Yeah, because young people.
Superintendent McKinney, I'd like to thank you, and I hope we will be continuing this dialogue in the future, because this is what the African Burial Ground is about.
Yes.
Thank you very much. Good night.
Thank you all.